Pedro woke to the echo of the bell clanging through the long corridors of the orphanage, a sound he knew too well, but it still stirred a heaviness inside him. He stretched in the small, metal-framed bed, the thin blanket tangled around his legs, and stared at the ceiling cracked with time. The room was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of other children stirring. The walls, painted a dull white, seemed colder in the morning light. The air smelled like soap and antiseptic clean, but lifeless. Pedro sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes with the back of his hand, the way he always did when he wasn't ready to face another day. At 7 years old, Pedro was one of the quiet ones, not because he had nothing to say, but because he had learned early on that silence sometimes hurt less than hope. He didn't remember his mother's face. He remembered sounds, flashes of cold pavement, the rumble of buses, a woman's voice humming a lullaby just before the world turned dark. The streets had been his first home, and though the memories were fragmented, the loneliness from those days never quite left him. He had been found curled beneath a tattered blanket near a bus stop at 2 years old. Social services had brought him here, the House of St. Maria, where time passed in rhythms of bells, meals, prayers, and the endless waiting for someone to pick you. People came often. They'd walk through the hallways with fake smiles and kind eyes, pointing, whispering. Some children left with them. Pedro never did. He would always sit up a little straighter when families came. He would comb his tight curls with his fingers and press his shirt smooth. He didn't ask questions. He didn't cry. He just waited, but they never chose him. They'd glance over him like he wasn't there, or worse. They'd smile politely and move on. Some whispered things to the staff when they thought he wasn't listening, things like, "too old," or "not quite what we're looking for." Once, Pedro heard a woman say, softly, "We just want someone who looks like us." He didn't understand all of it, not then, but he understood enough to feel a knot in his stomach that hadn't gone away since. And yet, he believed. He believed that someone out there was looking for him. Not for a child with lighter skin or a baby who hadn't seen the world's cruelty, but for him, for Pedro. That morning, like all mornings, he stood up and made his bed neatly, careful to fold each corner just the way Sister Helena had taught him. He whispered a little prayer as he did every day. "Please let today be the day someone sees me." Outside, the sky was cloudy, the kind of gray that soaked into your bones. Pedro pulled on his shoes and walked to the window, watching the wind rustle the branches of the lone tree in the courtyard. Somewhere out, there was a world he hadn't seen yet, a world with laughter, with hugs, with someone calling his name, not to scold, but to love. He didn't know how or when, but he believed he would find it. He had to. The hallway echoed with the sounds of footsteps and distant voices. Pedro walked slowly, his small hands brushing against the cold, chipped walls as he made his way to the common room. Morning sunlight tried to squeeze through the high windows, casting long streaks on the tiled floor. Everything here had a tired look: worn rugs, faded curtains, books with missing pages. But this was home. He passed by a group of younger children playing with plastic blocks. One of them looked up and smiled at him. Pedro smiled back, gently patting the boy's head before moving on. He was kind like that, always gentle, even when his heart felt heavy. The nuns said he had an old soul, one that had seen too much, but still chose kindness. In the corner of the room, Sister Helena was unpacking a box of donated clothes. She looked up as Pedro approached, offering a warm smile that didn't quite reach her tired eyes. "Bom dia, Pedro," she greeted in soft Portuguese. "How did you sleep?" "Okay," he answered, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded and handed him a small pile of folded clothes. "Can you help me sort these by size?" Pedro took the clothes with a nod. He didn't mind helping. It gave his hands something to do, something that made the hours pass faster. He worked quietly, folding, organizing, occasionally glancing toward the front entrance. Today was Tuesday. Families usually visited on Tuesdays. At noon, the doorbell rang. Pedro's heart jumped. Voices, laughter, a burst of perfume and cologne as the door opened and a couple stepped inside, followed by the headmistress. Pedro stood a little taller, subtly fixing his shirt. He didn't rush toward them. He never did. He had learned that being too eager only made the disappointment sting worse. So he stayed near the window, pretending to be busy while his eyes followed their every move. They looked nice. The woman had bright eyes and soft curls, and the man had a gentle smile. They knelt to talk to some of them. Children, listening, laughing, asking questions. Pedro's heart beat faster when the woman looked in his direction. For a moment, just a second, her gaze rested on him, and then it moved on. He swallowed hard and looked down at the pile of clothes in his hands. He folded another shirt, slower this time. After a while, the couple left with the headmistress. Another child was chosen, not him. Again. That night, Pedro sat on the edge of his bed. The small teddy bear Sister Helena had given him, clutched to his chest. He stared at the ceiling, blinking back tears. He wasn't going to cry. He couldn't. Crying wouldn't change anything. But in his heart, questions screamed louder than he could bear. Why not me? What am I missing? What do they see that makes them walk away? He curled under his blanket, pulling it up to his chin. The wind howled outside, and the orphanage creaked like an old ship in a storm. In the darkness, he whispered the same words he did every night, the same prayer he stitched into the stars he could barely see through the dusty window. Please, let someone choose me. Let someone love me. I'm still here. I'm still waiting. The days bled into one another like dull shades of gray. Mornings came too quickly, bringing with them the cold breakfast of porridge and the hard reality of waiting. Pedro was used to the rhythm by now, the meals, the games, the prayers, the chores, but there was a restlessness in his heart, a gnawing emptiness that only grew deeper with each passing day. The children at the orphanage had their own ways of dealing with the monotony. Some played games of tag in the small courtyard. Others huddled together whispering secrets only they understood. Pedro, however, found his solace in the corners of the building near the old bookshelf, or by the cracked window where he could see the street outside, the world that seemed so far but still so close. That afternoon, Sister Helena asked him to run an errand for her. He was glad for the chance to leave the usual bustle of the orphanage, even if just for a moment. As he stepped out into the cold courtyard, the sky above was cloudy, with dark clouds gathering. The wind cut through his thin coat, making him shiver. Pedro pulled the collar up higher, hugging his arms close to his chest, as he hurried toward the small store just down the street. It was only a short walk, but it felt like an adventure. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to pretend that he was on his own, not bound by the orphanage, not waiting for a family that might never come. He was free in those moments, the world before him an open road, unmarked and full of possibilities. The storekeeper, an old woman with sharp eyes and a soft voice, handed him a bag of sugar, and he turned to head back. That was when he saw her. A woman was standing on the sidewalk just outside the orphanage gates. She was tall, with dark hair tied neatly in a bun. She wore a long, warm-looking coat and looked out of place against the gray backdrop of the street. Pedro stopped in his tracks, unsure of who she was. There was something about her, something familiar, though he couldn't place it. She turned and saw him. For a long, uncomfortable moment, they just stared at each other. Then the woman smiled. "Hello," she called softly, stepping closer. Pedro hesitated. Something about the woman's smile made him feel both nervous and hopeful at the same time. Was she here for him? Are you a new volunteer?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The woman chuckled, her laughter light and warm. No, I'm not a volunteer," she said kindly, crouching to his level. "I'm here to see someone special." Pedro frowned, his curiosity piqued. "Someone special?" She nodded, her eyes gentle. "Yes, someone who is just waiting for the right person to come along. Someone who deserves love more than anyone else I know." Pedro's heart skipped a beat. Could it be? Could this woman have come for him? He opened his mouth, but the words stuck in his throat. He had never been able to ask directly. He had never dared to, for fear of hearing the answer he already knew. The woman seemed to sense his confusion. She smiled again, a soft, reassuring smile. "Don't worry, Pedro," she said, her voice quiet. "I'm not here to take you away today, but I've been watching you for a long time, and I know exactly who you are." Pedro's breath caught in his chest. You know me?" "Of course I do." The woman's eyes shone with something more than kindness. There was something deeper, a knowledge that made Pedro feel both seen and understood. "You're the brave little boy who never gives up, aren't you?" Pedro nodded, unsure of what to say next. It was like she had read his mind, seen right through the walls he had built. He didn't know whether to feel excited or afraid. The woman stood up slowly, brushing off her coat. "I'll be back," she said softly, her words lingering in the air. "Don't give up, Pedro. Not ever." Pedro watched her as she walked away, her figure slowly disappearing into the distance. His heart raced, his thoughts swirling in a storm of emotions. He had never had anyone speak to him like that. No one had ever really seen him, not the way this woman had. But what did it mean? Was this the beginning of something real, or was it just another dream? Just another person who had vanished from his life like so many others before. Pedro stood there for a moment, the wind tugging at his coat, but his mind was 1,000 miles away. He clutched the bag of sugar tightly in his hands and whispered to himself, "Maybe, just maybe, this time will be different." The rain came without warning. Thunder rumbled in the distance as dark clouds broke open, pouring down over the orphanage and its tired roof. Pedro sat on the windowsill, legs tucked beneath him, his breath fogging the cold glass as he watched the storm roll through the city. He should have felt afraid. Storms used to terrify him when he was smaller, but this one matched how he felt inside. Loud, heavy, chaotic. It had been 2 days since the mysterious woman had appeared outside the orphanage gates. No one else had seen her, not Sister Helena, not the other children. No one believed she was real. "Are you sure, Pedro?" Sister Helena had asked gently, her brow creased with concern. "There was no visitor scheduled." "I saw her," he insisted quietly, but firmly. "She said she knew me." Sister Helena had smiled in that careful way adults did when they didn't want to argue, but didn't believe you either. Sometimes our hearts see what they hope for. Pedro didn't argue. He just walked away, head down, fists tight. But he had seen her. The way she looked at him wasn't something he could forget. She had spoken to him like he mattered, like she already loved him. Now, the doubt began to creep in. What if she wasn't coming back? What if it was just his imagination playing tricks? He watched as the rain turned the courtyard into a pool of mud, the lonely tree shaking violently under the wind's fury. His chest felt heavy. He hugged his knees tighter, burying his face between them. That night, he couldn't sleep. The storm raged on, and with every gust of wind that rattled the windows, his thoughts raced. Was he foolish for believing, for still hoping? He got out of bed and tiptoed through the silent hallway, barefoot on the cold floor, until he reached the chapel. It was dark, lit only by the flicker of a single candle. Pedro knelt before the wooden altar, the same one he had come to so many times before. But tonight was different. He didn't pray for a family. He prayed for strength. "God," he whispered, his voice breaking, "if I don't have a family, can I at least have courage? Courage to keep hoping, even when it hurts?" The candle's flame wavered, casting soft shadows on his face. He closed his eyes, and in that silence, something deep within him stirred. A voice not from outside, but from within whispered, something he didn't expect. "You're not forgotten." Pedro opened his eyes slowly, the warmth of the words still lingering in his chest. He didn't know if they were real or imagined, but they gave him something to hold on to. Not a promise of tomorrow, but a reason to keep standing today. As he returned to his bed and curled beneath the thin blanket, he didn't feel better, but he felt braver. And sometimes that was enough. The days after the storm seemed to move slower, as if the weather itself had stolen some of the urgency from the world outside. The orphanage felt quieter than usual, the children more subdued, and Pedro found himself more withdrawn. The excitement from his brief encounter with the woman had faded into uncertainty, leaving a lingering ache in its place. But there was something different about this ache. It wasn't the kind that came from loss. It wasn't the kind of ache that made you feel like you were being torn apart. No, this one was quieter. It was the ache of waiting, of knowing that something was on the horizon, even if you couldn't quite see it yet. Pedro couldn't explain it, but every time he closed his eyes, he could almost hear her voice. "I'll be back." The words echoed through his mind like a song that wouldn't stop playing. And despite everything, despite the years of rejection, he believed her. One afternoon, as Pedro wandered aimlessly through the halls, a faint sound caught his attention. It was coming from the front door, soft, hesitant knocks. Pedro froze. He had never heard a knock like that before. It wasn't the hurried raps of the delivery man or the busy knocks of visitors here to see other children. It was different. It was slow, deliberate. He hesitated for only a second before making his way to the door. His heart beat faster as he approached, unsure of what he was about to find. When he opened the door, there she was, the woman. Her warm smile was the first thing he saw, and despite the storm of doubt that had clouded his mind, his heart recognized her instantly. "You came back," Pedro whispered, his voice barely audible. The woman nodded, her eyes sparkling with something he couldn't quite place. She stepped inside, her coat dripping from the rain, and Pedro noticed for the first time how she looked tired, but there was a sense of purpose in her steps. "I did," she said softly, "and I've come to ask you something very important, Pedro." Pedro's throat tightened. "What is it?" She crouched down to his level, her gaze never wavering. "I've been watching you for a long time, Pedro. I see how strong you are, how kind you are, how much you've been through." Pedro felt his pulse race as her words sank in. His heart ached, but this time it was different. There was something about her that made him feel seen, truly seen. He started, but his words faltered. He didn't know what to say. He had always wanted someone to see him, to choose him, but he had learned long ago that hope often led to disappointment. But this woman, she wasn't like the others. "I'm not here to offer you something easy," she continued. "This isn't about taking you away from here, not today. But I've seen what you've been through, Pedro, and I want to help you. I want to help you find your place in the world." Pedro's breath caught in his chest. Was it possible? Could she really be talking about what he thought she was? Was she offering him something he had longed for all his life? "Do you want to come with me, Pedro?" she asked gently. "Do you want a family?" The words hung in the air between them, fragile and weighty all at once. Pedro's mind raced, his heart a whirlwind of emotions. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to leap forward into the hope she was offering, but something held him back. "I'm scared," he admitted quietly, looking at the ground. His voice was barely a whisper. What if you don't come back? What if I'm left here again?" The woman's expression softened, and she reached out, lifting his chin gently so their eyes met. "Pedro, I can't promise you that everything will be easy, but I can promise you that I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." For the first time in years, Pedro allowed himself to truly believe. He nodded slowly, a tear slipping down his cheek, one that he didn't try to hide. "Yes," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. "I want to come with you." The woman smiled, a warm, radiant smile that filled the room with light. She reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "Then let's go, Pedro. The world is waiting for you." Pedro stepped outside, his heart soaring. He wasn't sure what lay ahead, but for the first time, he knew he wasn't walking alone. The rain had stopped, and the sky above seemed a little brighter, as if the clouds had parted just for him. The air outside felt different, fresher somehow. As Pedro stepped into the rain-soaked world, he took a deep breath, the coolness of the wind mingling with the fading scent of wet earth. It was a new beginning, he knew. He could feel it in the way his pulse quickened, in the way his feet felt lighter as he walked beside the woman. She held his hand firmly, like she knew the weight of what was happening, like she understood how fragile this moment was. He wasn't just stepping outside the orphanage anymore. He was stepping into the unknown, into a life that wasn't sure, wasn't promised, but it was his to take. They walked in silence for a while, the only sound between them, the soft tap of their shoes against the wet pavement. Pedro kept his eyes on the ground, unsure of how to process everything. The overwhelming joy and fear fought inside him, pulling him in different directions. "You're not alone anymore, Pedro," the woman said after a while, breaking the silence. Her voice was calm, soothing, like the steady rhythm of a heartbeat. "I'm not leaving you. I've made a promise to you, and I'm going to keep it." Pedro looked up at her, searching her face for the sincerity. He needed to believe her. She was exactly what he needed in that moment, someone who made him feel like he mattered, not just as a child to be taken care of, but as a person. As Pedro, he felt a warmth spread through him, one he hadn't felt in so long, and a small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "Where are we going?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, but filled with curiosity. "To my house," she replied, her voice light but firm. "To a place where you can be safe, where you can be loved." Pedro nodded, still processing her words. Love. He had heard that word before, sometimes from the staff, sometimes in the stories the other children whispered about their own parents. But it had always seemed so far away, a distant dream that didn't belong to someone like him. But this felt real. The way she spoke, the way she held his hand. It felt like a dream, yes, but one he didn't want to wake up from. They reached the car, a sleek black vehicle that looked too expensive for a boy like him. The woman opened the door for him and helped him inside, her smile warm as she gently tucked him into the seat. Pedro stared out of the window, the world outside passing by in a blur of colors and shapes. As the car moved through the streets, Pedro's thoughts scattered. He thought about the orphanage, about the other children he left behind, about the empty bed he would never sleep in again. A part of him would always carry those memories, but another part was ready to let go, to start fresh. "Do you have a name?" Pedro asked suddenly, turning to the woman. She glanced at him, her eyes softened. "Yes, my name is Anna." Pedro repeated it softly to himself, testing the sound of it. "Anna?" It felt right. "Are you sure I'm not dreaming?" he asked after a pause, his voice uncertain. Anna chuckled softly. "If you're dreaming, Pedro, then it's a dream I've been waiting for too. And I'm not going to let you wake up from it." Pedro smiled, a little more confidently this time. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that, for once, someone really meant what they said, that he had found someone who wouldn't turn away. The car passed through the city streets, and as Pedro looked out of the window, he realized something. He wasn't running away anymore. He wasn't hiding. For the first time in his life, he was moving toward something, toward a future, toward hope, toward a place where he wasn't just a forgotten boy on the streets, but a child who mattered. The car pulled up in front of a small house at the edge of the city. It wasn't grand, but it was warm and inviting. There was a porch with a swing, and the windows glowed with soft light. "This is where we'll start, Pedro," Anna said gently as she helped him out of the car. Pedro's eyes widened as he looked at the house. It wasn't a mansion, but it felt like a home. It felt safe. They walked inside, and Anna showed him to a room at the back. It was small, with a soft bed, a window that overlooked the garden, and a small nightlight glowing softly beside the bed. Pedro stood in the doorway for a moment, his breath catching in his throat. "This is yours," Anna said quietly, as if sensing the wonder in his eyes. Pedro stepped inside, feeling the warmth of the room, the soft scent of fresh linens. He ran his fingers over the quilt on the bed, the smoothness of the fabric feeling real, comforting. He turned to Anna, his voice barely a whisper. "Do you really think I can be happy here?" Anna crouched down in front of him, lifting his chin gently so that their eyes met. "I know you can, Pedro. It's going to take time, but I'll be with you every step of the way. We're in this together." Pedro smiled, for the first time in a long while. It wasn't a perfect smile, but it was enough. Enough to believe in the possibility of tomorrow. Enough to believe in the dream that was no longer so far away. Pedro woke to the soft, warm light of morning streaming through his new window. For a moment, he simply lay there, eyes wide open, listening to the quiet hum of the world outside. The birds were chirping, the sun was rising, and everything felt so peaceful, so different from the cold, harsh mornings at the orphanage. He stretched, feeling the softness of the blanket beneath him, the newness of the sheets. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the weight of fear pressing on his chest. Instead, he felt something he had almost forgotten existed: comfort. Anna had promised him that things would be different, but now, sitting in the warmth of this small room, Pedro found himself wondering if he could truly believe it. Could he believe that he was worthy of a life like this? Could he trust that this time, the people who opened their doors to him wouldn't close them again? He swung his legs off the bed and stood up, his bare feet touching the cool wooden floor. The room was quiet, save for the distant sound of Anna moving around downstairs. He walked over to the window, pulling the curtains aside just enough to peek outside. The garden in front of the house was beautiful. Flowers bloomed in bright, welcoming colors, and a few butterflies fluttered lazily among the petals. The yard was full of life, full of things that Pedro had never known. It was a space that seemed to say, "Here, you are welcome. You are safe." A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Pedro, on his voice, called gently from the other side. "Are you awake, honey?" Pedro quickly wiped his eyes, feeling a little embarrassed. He didn't want her to see how much he was still processing. "Yes," he called back, his voice a little hoarse. The door creaked open, and Anna stepped inside with a tray of breakfast. She smiled warmly at him, as though this was the most natural thing in the world, bringing him food in the morning, making sure he was okay. "Good morning," she said, setting the tray down on the small desk beside the bed. "I made your favorite pancakes with syrup and a little bit of fruit. I thought you might like it." Pedro's stomach rumbled at the sight of the pancakes, and he smiled shyly. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice uncertain. It had been so long since someone had cared enough to make him breakfast. Anna didn't wait for him to respond further. She simply sat on the edge of the bed, her presence calm and comfort. "How did you sleep?" "Good," Pedro replied, sitting down at the edge of the bed and taking a tentative bite of the pancakes. They were warm and sweet, the syrup sticky and comforting. He couldn't remember the last time he had something this simple and satisfying. "I'm glad," Anna said, her eyes kind. "You know, today is going to be a big day. We'll take it slow, but I want to show you the house where everything is, where you can find what you need. We'll also go to the park later if you want." Pedro looked up from his plate. A park. The word sounded so ordinary, so simple. He had only ever seen parks on TV, never had the chance to walk through one, to run around in the grass. It sounded like a dream. "That sounds nice," he said, his voice quieter now, almost as if he couldn't believe that something as simple as a park could make him feel so hopeful. Anna smiled, reading the hesitation in his eyes. "It will be fun, and you can take your time. You're in charge here, Pedro. This is your home now. I'm just here to help you settle in." Pedro's heart fluttered. It felt like a weight lifting from his chest. He had never felt like he belonged anywhere. But here, in this house, with Anna, he felt something different. It wasn't perfection. It wasn't easy, but it was a start. And sometimes that was all you needed, just the beginning of something good. After finishing his breakfast, Anna led him downstairs, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. She showed him the house room by room, each space neat and cozy, with personal touches that made it feel lived in. There was a living room with soft couches and a television, a small kitchen where Anna promised they would cook together, and a bathroom with a bathtub Pedro was already eyeing, imagining how long it had been since he had soaked in warm water. Everything was so normal, so right. But as they moved through the house, Pedro's thoughts kept returning to the children he had left behind at the orphanage. Would they be okay? Would they ever find what he had found? "Are you okay?" Anna's voice interrupted his thoughts. Pedro nodded slowly, though his heart still felt heavy. "Yeah, I just wonder about the others, about the kids at the orphanage. Will they be okay?" Anna knelt down in front of him, her expression serious. "Pedro, it's okay to care about them, but right now, I need you to care about you. You're here, and you deserve to be happy. You deserve to have a future. I know it's hard to leave parts of your past behind, but that doesn't mean you can't still remember them." Pedro nodded, trying to process the truth in her words. It was hard, so hard, but maybe, just maybe, he could have a future here. As the day unfolded, Pedro found himself slowly embracing his new life. They went to the park, just like Anna promised. It was bigger and more beautiful than he could have imagined. The grass was soft beneath his feet, and the swings creaked gently in the wind as they soared into the air. He ran, he laughed, he played things he hadn't done in so long. And for the first time in his life, Pedro realized that maybe, just maybe, he could learn to let himself be happy again. The days began to blend together in a comforting routine. Pedro woke each morning to the warm smell of breakfast, the soft hum of the world around him stirring as Anna moved through the house, preparing for the day ahead. It was a life Pedro had never known, a life filled with normalcy and care. And with each passing day, he felt his heart open a little more. But there were still moments when the weight of his past crept up on him, uninvited, pulling him back to the places he didn't want to go. The faces of the other children at the orphanage, the hard faces of the people who had ignored him on the streets, the feeling of being invisible, forgotten. That night, after dinner, Anna noticed Pedro sitting by the window again, his eyes distant, his gaze focused on nothing in particular. The soft glow of the porch light lit his face, but there was a shadow in his eyes, a shadow that had been growing deeper over the past few days. She could sense it, the tension in his shoulders, the quiet withdrawal he seemed to have adopted when he thought she wasn't looking. She approached him slowly, unsure of how to begin the conversation, but knowing it was time. Pedro needed to face the parts of himself he had tried to bury, and Anna knew that if he didn't, those parts of him would start to weigh him down again. "Pedro," she said softly, sitting next to him on the windowsill, "what are you thinking about?" Pedro didn't answer immediately. His fingers nervously traced the edge of the windowsill, his mind lost in a swirl of emotions he couldn't fully name. Sometimes, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I still feel like I'm invisible." Anna's heart tightened at his words. She had seen the way Pedro interacted with others, the way he kept his distance, how he never asked for too much. It was as if he didn't believe he deserved to take up space. But that wasn't true. He deserved to be seen, to be heard, to take up as much space as anyone else. "Pedro," Anna said gently, her hand resting on his, "you're not invisible. You are here. You are real. And you are loved." Pedro looked at her, his eyes clouded with confusion. "But how? How can you love me when I'm just a kid with nothing to offer?" Anna exhaled softly, her heart breaking for him. "Love isn't about what you can give, Pedro. It's about who you are. You don't have to earn love. It's already yours. It always has been." Pedro stared at her, trying to process her words. He had never been told that before. He had been told to prove himself, to make himself worthy. But this was different. "Sometimes," Anna continued, "we carry things with us, things that don't belong to us, but we hold on to them because we think they define us. You've been carrying so much, Pedro, so much hurt, so much fear, but that doesn't have to be who you are." Pedro swallowed, feeling a lump form in his throat. He wanted to believe her, but how could he? How could he let go of the pain, the loneliness, the fear that had been with him for so long? What if it's too hard to let go? He whispered, the vulnerability in his voice raw and unguarded. Anna gave him a small, reassuring smile. "It will be hard. It won't be easy. But that's why you don't have to do it alone. You have me. You have this home. You have a future. And I promise you, Pedro, you are not defined by your past." Pedro's breath hitched as a tear slid down his cheek. He wiped it quickly, embarrassed by the sudden rush of emotion. But Anna just reached out and gently cupped his face in her hands, wiping away the tear with her thumb. "I know it's scary," she said softly, "but you're safe here. You can take your time. You don't have to carry all that weight anymore." Pedro felt the tightness in his chest loosen just a little. Maybe it wouldn't be easy to let go of everything he had carried for so long, but he had to try. For the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of something more than fear, hope. "I'll try," he said quietly, his voice shaky but determined. "I'll try." Anna smiled warmly and pulled him into a gentle hug. Pedro rested his head on her shoulder, feeling the weight of his past begin to lift, just a little. It wouldn't be an overnight change, he knew that. But for the first time, he believed that he could start to heal, that he could start to see himself not as a forgotten child on the streets, but as someone worthy of love, of happiness, of a future. For the first time in a long time, Pedro allowed himself to believe that he could be more than the sum of his pain. And that was a start. The days turned warmer as spring crept quietly into the city. The air smelled of damp earth and blooming flowers, and the sun stretched longer across the sky each evening. Pedro had begun to settle into his new life, slowly, cautiously, like someone learning to walk on unfamiliar ground. But even in the comfort of Anna's home, even surrounded by warmth and safety, Pedro still struggled with one thing: his own name. At the orphanage, he had heard his name shouted in discipline, whispered in pity, or passed over in silence. Rarely had it been spoken with affection, and never had it felt like it belonged to someone who mattered. Now Anna spoke it different. She said it with kindness, with purpose, with care. One morning, while they sat together at the kitchen table, Anna sipping coffee, Pedro nibbling on toast, She set her cup down and looked at him with a thoughtful expression. "Do you know what your name means, Pedro?" she asked gently. He looked up, surprised by the question. "No," he answered, shaking his head. "I never thought about it." Ana smiled and leaned forward slightly. "Pedro means rock in Portuguese. Strong, steady, unbreakable." Pedro blinked, stunned into silence. No one had ever said that about him before. "You are strong, Pedro," she continued. "You've survived things that most people can't even imagine. But you didn't just survive, you stayed kind. You kept your heart open. That's strength. That's what it means to be a rock." Pedro looked down at his hands. They were small, scarred in some places, but they didn't shake. He remembered the nights he had curled up beneath stairwells, the hunger that clawed at his belly, the fear of being alone. He remembered the coldness of the orphanage floor, the sound of the other children crying in their sleep. And yet, he had survived. "Do you believe that?" Ana asked softly. "That you're strong?" Pedro hesitated. It was hard to believe something about yourself that you'd never been told. But maybe he could try. "I think I want to believe it," he said quietly. "That's a start," Ana said with a gentle smile. "And I believe it for both of us, until you're ready." That night, Pedro sat at his small desk, staring at a blank sheet of paper. Ana had given it to him, along with a pencil and a challenge. Draw something that shows who you are, not who you were told to be, not who you think you have to be. Just you. For a long time, Pedro didn't move. But eventually, slowly, he began to draw. At first, it was shapes uncertain, scattered. Then lines. Then something more. He drew a boy standing in the middle of a storm, surrounded by swirling winds and heavy clouds. But the boy wasn't falling. He stood tall, firm, unmoving. At the bottom of the page, in careful letters, Pedro wrote one word: rock. He stared at it for a long time, the name slowly sinking into his chest like a seed, finding the right soil. The next morning, he showed the drawing to Ana. Her eyes filled with quiet pride as she looked at it, then back at him. "You see it now, don't you?" she said. Pedro nodded. "I'm Pedro," he said, a little louder than usual. "And I'm not invisible." Ana's smile broke into a full grin. "No, you're not. You're right here. And I'm so proud of you." Pedro folded the paper carefully and tucked it into a drawer by his bed. He had never owned anything like that before, not just a drawing, but a declaration, a truth. He was Pedro. He was strong. He was seen. And from that day forward, when he said his name, he said it with pride. Spring bloomed full around the house, the colors of the garden vibrant against the pale blue sky. Pedro spent more time outside now, walking the path through the garden with Ana, touching the petals of the flowers, feeling the soft earth beneath his feet. Each day, he felt himself coming alive again slowly, like a flower unfurling its petals in the morning sun. But though the outside world seemed to welcome him with open arms, Pedro still found himself struggling in quieter, darker moments. When night fell, when the house grew quiet and Ana went to bed, he sometimes sat at his window, staring out into the street. He hadn't completely let go of the fear that everything would be taken from him again, the fear that one day Ana would disappear, just like the others, that he would be left behind once more. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon and the first stars appeared, Pedro found himself standing by the window again. His gaze was distant, his mind adrift. "Pedro," Ana's voice called from behind him. He turned, startled. Ana stood in the doorway of the living room, her expression soft but curious. "It's a beautiful evening. Would you like to take a walk with me?" Pedro hesitated, his gaze returning to the street outside. The darkness felt like an old friend, the kind that had always been there, lurking, waiting to remind him of the things he tried to forget. "I don't know," Pedro muttered, his voice unsure. I feel like I don't belong here sometimes. Like I'm just waiting for something to go wrong." Ana walked toward him, her steps slow, deliberate. "I understand that feeling," she said gently, "but you don't have to walk through the dark alone anymore. You've never been alone, even when it felt like it." Pedro swallowed hard, his throat tightening. "But what if you leave me? What if I'm not good enough?" Ana paused in front of him, kneeling to meet his eyes. She reached out and took his hands, folding them gently in hers. "Pedro," she said, her voice steady and kind, You are good enough. You've always been enough. And I'm not going anywhere. I'm here, right here. Pedro looked at her, her eyes filled with so much love and certainty that, for the first time, he allowed himself to believe it. Maybe, just maybe, the light he had been searching for wasn't out there in the darkness. It was right here, beside him, in the warmth of Anna's hands. He took a deep breath and nodded, his chest lifting slightly. Okay, let's go. Together, they stepped outside into the cool night air. The world was quieter now, the streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. They walked slowly down the path, side by side, Anna's hand resting lightly on Pedro's shoulder. The stars above twinkled softly, as though watching over them, and the wind carried the scent of blooming flowers. As they walked, Anna spoke of the future, small things, simple things. She spoke of days spent painting the garden fence, of planting new flowers in the yard, of taking long walks through the park. There was no rush in her words, no urgency, just the promise of tomorrow, and the promise that Pedro would be there to see it. For the first time in a long time, Pedro felt his mind calm. The fear still lingered just beneath the surface, but it didn't have the same grip on him. Not anymore. He wasn't sure when it had happened, but somewhere along the way, he had started to trust again. They reached the end of the street, where the road curved gently toward a small hill. Anna stopped and looked up at the sky. "It's beautiful tonight," she said, her voice soft, as if speaking to the stars themselves. "Just like you, Pedro." Pedro smiled, feeling something warm stir in his chest at her words. He looked up at the stars as well, trying to make out constellations he had only seen in books. The night didn't seem so dark anymore. It wasn't scary. It wasn't a place of fear. It was simply a part of the world, one that held space for him too. Anna turned to him and smiled, and in that moment, Pedro realized that he had made it this far. He had survived the darkness, the storm, the loneliness. And now he was here, with Anna, with the future. He wasn't alone anymore. "Thank you," Pedro said, his voice barely above a whisper, but full of emotion. "For believing in me." Anna smiled back at him, her eyes glistening with pride. "I've always believed in you, Pedro. I always will." And with that, they stood together, side by side, under the stars. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of new experiences for Pedro. He spent his days learning how to live a life he never thought possible, one filled with routine, joy, and the comfort of knowing he was loved. Anna's home became a true refuge, a place where he could grow and heal, not just physically, but emotionally. One evening, after a long day of planting flowers in the garden together, Anna sat Pedro down in the living room. The air was cool, the windows wide open to let in the evening breeze, and the soft glow of the lamplight cast a peaceful warmth throughout the room. "Pedro," Anna began, her voice serious but gentle, "there's something important I want to talk to you about." Pedro's heart fluttered slightly. His mind immediately ran through the worst-case scenarios, imagining all the things that could go wrong. Had he done something wrong? Was she about to say that this wasn't working? Anna reached out, taking his hand in hers. "I've been thinking a lot about you, about us, and I want to make something official." Pedro tilted his head, confused. "Official?" Anna smiled, squeezing his hand. "I'm not just someone who's taking care of you, Pedro. I'm not just a foster mom or a caretaker. I want you to be a part of my family. For real." Pedro's breath caught in his throat. "You mean you want me to live here forever?" "Yes," Anna said simply, her eyes filled with a warmth he had never seen before. "I want you to be my son. I want to adopt you, Pedro. I want you to carry my name and know that you are loved, no matter what happens." Pedro stared at her, the words sinking into his chest like a heavy weight. He had never heard anything like this before, not from anyone. He had been rejected so many times in the past, made to feel like he didn't belong. And now Anna was offering him something he had never dared to dream about: a family, a future. "Do you mean that?" Pedro asked, his voice shaking. "You really want me to be your son?" "More than anything," Anna replied, her voice full of emotion. "I know it's a big decision, and I know it's not going to be easy, but we can do it together. You don't have to be afraid anymore, Pedro. I'm here." Tears welled up in Pedro's eyes, and he quickly wiped them away. He had never been able to imagine something like this. He had never been able to see himself as someone who could belong somewhere. But Ana was showing him that he was worth it, that he was enough. I don't know what to say, Pedro whispered, his voice breaking. I've never had a family. I don't know how to be part of one. Ana smiled and pulled him into a gentle hug, holding him tightly. You don't have to know everything right now. It's okay to take your time. But I want you to know that you are my family. You belong with me, Pedro. You've always belonged. Pedro's chest tightened with a mixture of emotions: gratitude, fear, relief, but most of all hope. He felt it deep inside him, that spark of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in so long. I'll try, he said quietly, his voice full of determination. I'll try to be part of this family. I'll try to believe that I belong here. Ana pulled back slightly, brushing a tear from his cheek with her thumb. You don't have to try, Pedro. You already do. The next few days were filled with discussions, paperwork, and a sense of anticipation that kept Pedro on edge. He had never been part of something so official, so binding. But as the days went by, he began to feel a peace settling into him. This was real. This wasn't a dream. Ana was his family now, and he was her son. One afternoon, Ana took Pedro to the park, just as they had done countless times before. But this time, there was something different about the day. It was sunny, the air warm, and the park was full of children playing, families walking together. As they sat on a bench, Ana turned to Pedro with a smile. I have something for you, she said, pulling a small envelope from her bag. Pedro took it, his hands trembling slightly. He opened the envelope carefully and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was his adoption papers. Pedro's heart raced as he read through them. It felt surreal. It felt like the weight of years of fear and uncertainty were lifting from his shoulders with each word he read. The paper wasn't just a legal document, it was proof of something much deeper. It was proof that he had a future, a real future. This is it, Pedro, Ana said softly, her voice full of emotion. This is the moment. You are officially my son, and nothing will ever change that. Pedro looked up at her, his eyes filled with wonder. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Ana replied, her voice thick with emotion. Just know that you're loved, always. Pedro smiled through his tears. Thank you for believing in me. As they stood up, hand in hand, Pedro looked around at the families in the park, the laughter of children ringing in the air. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was part of something bigger, something real. He wasn't alone anymore. The world looked different now. The streets weren't as threatening, the shadows not as long, and the silence in Pedro's heart wasn't as heavy. With Ana by his side, his mother, he was beginning to call her in his heart, even if the words still caught on his tongue. He started to breathe in ways he never had before. Each breath didn't feel like a fight for survival anymore. It felt like living. Still, healing wasn't a straight road. There were days when Pedro woke with a tightness in his chest he couldn't explain. Days when laughter at school felt too loud, or hugs from Ana too overwhelming. Days when the ghost of his past crept in quietly, whispering that it was all too good to be true. But now he had something he never had before, the space to feel without fear. One such day came shortly after the adoption papers had been signed. Pedro came home from school quieter than usual. His backpack hung from one shoulder, and his steps were slow, dragging across the wooden floor as he walked into the house. Ana was in the kitchen, humming softly as she stirred a pot on the stove. The smell of tomato sauce filled the room, rich and comforting. Hey, kiddo, she said, wiping her hands on a dish towel and smiling at him. How was school? Pedro didn't answer at first. He stood in the doorway, eyes fixed on the floor. Ana noticed immediately. She turned off the stove and came over, kneeling in front of him. Pedro, what's wrong? He looked up at her slowly, his eyes glassy but holding back the tears. Today, someone asked me where my real mom was. Ana's heart sank. I didn't know what to say, Pedro continued, voice shaking. They said I didn't look like I belonged with you, that I didn't look like your son. Ana felt a fire rise in her chest, but she stayed calm. She reached out and took Pedro's hand. Do you remember what I told you, Pedro? That being a family isn't about how we look. It's about how we love. It's about how we show up for each other. Every day, Pedro bit his lip. But what if they're right? What if I'll always look like I don't belong? Ana cupped his face in her hands, firm but gentle. Then we show them they're wrong. We show them what love really looks like, because you do belong with me in this home. In this life, Pedro's eyes overflowed then, the tears falling fast, and he didn't try to stop them. Anna pulled him into her arms, and he held on tightly, burying his face in her shoulder. They stayed like that for a long time. Later, Anna showed him a picture frame she had kept in the living room. It had been empty for months, waiting. Now, she took a new photo, a simple one, just the two of them on the couch, smiling. She placed it in the frame and set it back on the table. "That's us," she said softly. "That's our truth." Pedro looked at the photo and felt something settle inside him. The ache of not being enough started to fade, replaced by something steady, something strong. He was Pedro. He was Anna's son, and no one could take that away from him. As the months passed, Pedro's world became a little more defined, a little more certain. He had begun to make friends at school, kids who saw him not as an orphan, not as a boy who had been abandoned, but as Pedro, the boy who liked to play soccer, who laughed loudly when he thought something was funny, who had a dream of one day being a writer. His teachers had noticed the change too. He was more confident, more engaged in class. But it wasn't just school that had changed. It was everything. His relationship with Anna blossomed into something deeper, something that felt as natural as breathing. He was beginning to feel like he had always belonged here, like this was always the place he was meant to be. And yet, despite all the growth, there were still moments of vulnerability, moments where the past would come rushing back, uninvited. One Sunday afternoon, Anna took Pedro to visit the park. They hadn't gone there in a while. The spring flowers had given way to summer blooms, and the sun was high in the sky, casting long shadows and bathing everything in golden light. They walked along the path, Pedro's hand in Anna's, just enjoying the simple pleasure of each other's company. But as they rounded a corner, Pedro froze. In the distance, sitting by the bench near the playground, was a group of kids. One of them was familiar. It was the boy who had asked about Pedro's real mom. The boy who had made him feel like he didn't belong. The boy was talking to a friend, and Pedro could hear snippets of the conversation. "He's adopted, you know," the boy was saying. "He doesn't even look like her. I don't get why she wants him." Anna felt Pedro stiffen beside her, his fingers tightening around hers. She glanced down at him, but he wasn't looking at her. He was staring at the group of kids, his face unreadable. "Pedro," Anna said gently, trying to get his attention. "We don't have to stay here. We can go." Pedro stood still for a moment, the weight of the moment pressing on his chest. He could feel the old shame creeping in, the feeling that he wasn't good enough, that he didn't belong. But then he looked up at Anna, and in her eyes, he saw nothing but love that was so strong, so unwavering. It wasn't the kind of love that could be erased by cruel words or the ignorance of others. It was the kind of love that had built this home, that had created the family he now had. He let out a shaky breath and squeezed Anna's hand back. "No," he said, his voice steady, though it trembled a little. "I want to stay." Anna smiled softly and nodded. "I'm right here," she said, her voice full of warmth and assurance. "And I'm not going anywhere." Pedro took a deep breath and began to walk forward, his steps slow at first, but then faster, more determined. As he approached the group of kids, the boy noticed him, and his expression shifted from casual to uncertain. Pedro didn't stop. He walked past them without acknowledging the boy, without looking at the others. He kept his head high, his chest open, feeling the strength that had slowly been growing in him over the months. When they reached the playground, Pedro took a seat on a nearby swing. Anna sat beside him, a protective presence beside him, but also one that allowed him the space to breathe. The boy from earlier didn't follow them. He stayed where he was, his gaze lingering for a moment before he turned away, perhaps unsure of how to respond to the quiet defiance in Pedro's actions. Anna didn't speak right away. She let Pedro sit in silence for a moment, letting him process the situation in his own way. Finally, after a few minutes, she spoke softly. "You did something brave today," she said. "You didn't let anyone else's words define you. You showed them who you are." Pedro turned to her, his eyes wide. "I did?" Anna nodded. "You did. You stood up for yourself. You stood up for the truth of who you are." Pedro's lips parted as he let the words sink in. The old pain wasn't gone. It wasn't something that could just vanish. But in that moment, something shifted inside him. He was more than his past. He was more than the hurtful words others said. He was Pedro, the boy who had been abandoned, but who had found a home. The boy who had been lost, but who had found a family. And for the first time, he realized he didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Not anymore. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you for making me believe." Anna smiled, her eyes soft with love and pride. "You always had it in you, Pedro. I just had to help you see it." Pedro leaned his head against her shoulder, feeling the warmth of her presence, the comfort of knowing that, in this moment, everything was exactly as it was meant to be. The days passed quickly as summer settled into the small town, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. At dusk, Pedro and Anna spent their time together, enjoying the simple pleasures of life: morning walks, shared meals, and quiet evenings under the stars. But there was still something growing in Pedro's heart, something he couldn't ignore. It wasn't fear anymore, but an anticipation, pull toward the future. Anna had been talking to him, more about school, about the next year, and what it would be like to be a part of a class that had known him from the start. Pedro had always kept to the shadows, the kid who never quite belonged. But now, in this home, with Anna, he was starting to see that the shadows weren't where he had to stay. One evening, after finishing his homework, Pedro sat in the living room with Anna, her presence a constant comfort. The house was quiet, save for the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Pedro watched as Anna picked up a photo album from the shelf. She had shown him these pictures before, snapshots of her life before he had entered it. But tonight, as Anna flipped through the pages, Pedro felt something stir in him, a need to share his own story. "Can I show you something, Anna?" he asked, his voice hesitant. "Of course," Anna replied, looking up at him with a gentle smile. "What is it?" Pedro bit his lip for a moment before standing up. He reached into the drawer by the desk where he kept his drawing supplies and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was the drawing he had done months ago, the one with the boy standing firm in the storm, surrounded by chaos, yet unwavering. He handed it to Anna, watching her eyes as she unfolded it and looked at the picture. "This is me," Pedro said quietly. "This is how I felt when I first came here. Like I was in the middle of a storm, and I didn't know if I'd make it through. But I did. And now, it's not just a storm anymore. It's me, standing in the world, learning to live." Anna's eyes filled with emotion as she looked at the drawing, tracing the lines of the boy with her finger. "It's beautiful, Pedro. You've come such a long way." Pedro nodded, his chest tightening with something he couldn't name. He had come so far, but there was still more to learn, more to face, more of his own story to tell. "Anna, I want to be someone. Not just the kid who was abandoned, not just the boy who was alone. I want to be more than that." Anna smiled, her voice soft but firm. "You already are, Pedro. You've always been someone. You've always mattered. You've just had to believe it for yourself." Pedro sat down beside her, his eyes turning back to the drawing. He traced the lines of the boy, imagining himself as that same figure, steadfast, strong, and ready to face whatever came next. His future wasn't written yet, but he was beginning to realize that he was the one holding the pen. "I think I'm ready," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Ready for what?" Anna asked, turning toward him, her expression warm with curiosity. "Ready for everything," Pedro replied, looking up at her with a small but genuine smile. "Ready for the next chapter." Anna's eyes softened, and she pulled him into a tight hug. "And I'll be here, every step of the way. Whatever comes, we'll face it together." Pedro closed his eyes, feeling the weight of her words settle in his heart. The storm that had once defined him was fading, replaced by the calm of a future he could begin to build. He wasn't alone anymore. He didn't have to face it all in the dark. Tomorrow would come, and he was ready to greet it. The air was crisp as the first day of school arrived. Pedro stood at the door, his backpack slung over his shoulder, the cool morning breeze ruffling his hair. Anna stood beside him, her hand on his back, her presence steady and grounding. The world outside had changed, and so had he. Today marked the beginning of something new, a new year at School, a new chapter of his life, and a fresh start in every way that mattered. "Are you ready?" Anna asked, her voice filled with pride and a hint of nervousness. She had been through her own share of first days, but this one felt different. This was Pedro's first day, not as the forgotten child, but as Pedro, her son, a boy with a future. Pedro nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, I think so." It wasn't an easy journey to get here. There had been moments of doubt, moments when the shadows of his past tried to creep back in. But now, as he stood at the threshold of something new, those fears felt smaller. He had a family now. He had a purpose. He had a place. Anna bent down and gave him a quick kiss on the forehead. "I'm so proud of you, Pedro. I can't wait to hear all about your day when you get home." Pedro smiled up at her, his heart swelling with emotion. For the first time, he wasn't just a boy who was surviving. He was a boy who was living. He was part of something. He was part of her. "Thanks, Anna," he said softly. "For everything." Anna's eyes sparkled, and she ruffled his hair. "You don't have to thank me, kiddo. This is just the beginning. You're going to do amazing things." Pedro took a deep breath and turned toward the school gate. It was a big step, one that carried with it the weight of all the experiences, the lessons, and the growth that had brought him here. But it also carried something lighter, hope. And for the first time, Pedro knew that he was worthy of it. As he walked through the gates of the school, he felt a shift. The world didn't feel as big or as overwhelming anymore. There were faces ahead of him, new friends, new opportunities, new challenges, but he was ready to meet them. No longer just the boy who had been abandoned, but the boy who had fought, who had endured, and who had been given a second chance. He wasn't alone anymore. He was Pedro. He was strong. He belonged. And as he walked into his classroom, a sense of peace settled over him. The journey wasn't over. There would be more challenges, more moments of growth. But now he had something he'd never had before. A family, a place to call home, a future. Pedro had found his place in the world, and for the first time in a long time, he was excited to see where it would take him. Hope you enjoyed the story. Comment where you're watching from, leave a like, and subscribe to the channel.